All right. Well, hello. My name is Vasilios Kosmakos. Today is April 27th, 2022. Who do I have the pleasure of speaking with today?
I'm Lucinda Faulkner Merritt. I work as the staff assistant and communications coordinator for the Itchitucknee Alliance, and I do some other things as on the side and volunteer in terms of water in Florida.
Fantastic. So, if you can kind of just begin telling me a little bit about your backstory. So, how did you get involved in water conservation, water quality? How did you get involved with the alliance, that type of thing?
Well, I started working in about 2011. I was hired by a group of artists working in Gainesville on water issues called Florida's Eden. Actually, their legal title was the Artists Association of North Florida or something like that, Artists Alliance of North Florida. But they went by Florida's Eden. Two people, Annie Pace and Stuart Thomas, hired me to be what they called their Blue Path coordinator. And they have banded together to raise awareness about what's going on in our springs in terms of ongoing loss of flow and increasing pollution. And so I started working with them. We did a couple of things. We did a book launch for Cynthia Barnett's book, Blue Revolution, which is really key because it outlines the ideas for a water ethic for the United States and for Florida. And then out of that, somehow it evolved into people who are concerned about the Itchitucknee River system up here that spans the border between Columbia and Suwannee counties, decided that because the Itchitucknee was suffering damage, they were going to form what they called the Itchitucknee Alliance. So I went to their launch meeting, and was fortunate enough to be hired to work as their staff assistant. And that was in 2013, I believe. Yeah, March 2013. The Alliance will be 10 years old next year. So I've been working for them since then, and I've had some volunteer and paid work with other groups. I helped at the beginning as a staff assistant for the Florida Springs Council. I did some staff assistant work for the Silver Springs Alliance. And I'm now volunteering with a group of people who are trying to put a constitutional amendment on the ballot in 2024 to guarantee the citizens of Florida the right to clean and healthy waters. That's volunteer work. I'm still working with the Itchitucknee Alliance.
So, discuss your work with the Interconnectedness Alliance a bit more. So, are you involved in that simply because that's your closest because it's simply you simply live near the Interconnectedness, or why the Interconnectedness Alliance as opposed to these other groups?
I first went to the Itchitucknee in 1969 before it was a state park. And I fell in love with it because it was gorgeous and because I had kind of a strange experience there. And it was the place to go back then for students at the University of Florida to go tubing down the river. I love all our springs, really. I grew up in Orlando, and the first spring I actually ever went swimming in was Rock Springs at Kelly Park in Apopka. But the Itchitucknee is near and dear to my heart. So that's why when I had a chance to get involved with it, I jumped at it because it's a special place. And actually, scientists tell us that of all the spring systems in Florida, the Itchitucknee would be the one that would be the easiest to return to health. Because although there's agriculture there, there's not a lot of it. It's an area of low population, and it's in a part of the state that hasn't really, it's like a little island in the part of the state that hasn't really suffered as much as some of the other springs have. So I guess I live near there. It's close to my heart, and I wanted to do what I could in my retirement to try to help.
So you mentioned you kind of had a rather special experience there. Would you mind sharing that with us?
Yeah, no, it's kind of weird. I went there for the first time in 1969 with my two roommates from Gainesville. One of my roommates was a guy, one was a girl. And our guy roommate, Chad, worked as a pizza delivery guy for Shelley's Pizza. And he came home one day and he said, "Do you girls want to go to a new spring that somebody showed me?" And we were like, yeah, we'll go. So we got in his car and we drove to the Ichetucknee, and it was an autumn day, but it wasn't cold yet. It was warm, but you could feel that autumn was coming. And we were the only people at the head spring, which was a delightful experience. We jumped in the water, we splashed around. I think Chad pulled a bar of soap out of his swim trunks and did a soap commercial on top of one of the rocks, singing and lathering up, and we were laughing. And finally, I got puckered. You know, when you're in the water for a long time, your skin starts to pucker. Mm-hmm. So I got out and took my towel and went up the little hill where the restrooms are now at the head spring. There was no restrooms there. It wasn't even a state park yet. So I lay down on the towel and I was drying off in the sun, and it was a beautiful day and there was a breeze and the trees were starting to turn. And I started to hear these little whisperings, like, and they gradually got louder and louder and louder until they resolved into a language, but it was not a language I had ever heard. So I thought, there's somebody in the woods. I'm going to find out who it is. So I stood up and I did a complete 360, and there was nobody else there. So it was a kind of, you could call it an auditory hallucination, but it was just a very strange thing that happened that kind of imprinted on me. Like, I was there at this time and this happened. And I study paranormal stuff. I mean, it's been an interest of mine since I was a small child, and I've taken classes with people in it. And it's been explained to me that these kind of auditory experiences are very, very common, and that at places where human emotions have run high, or where significant events have happened, those are the kind of places where people are most likely to experience something like this. And when you think about geologically and Paleo-Indian times, I mean, this would have been a place where Native Americans would have come to fish, to bathe, to whittle their arrowheads. I mean, it would have been a gathering place. So I don't know if what I experienced was that, if it was just something that misfired in my brain, but it's an experience that has stuck with me for a long time.
Yeah, and I think, and it seems like a lot of people that have this kind of rather profound connection to the Springs have, these kind of really powerful stories, and then if you talk to a lot of the, artists, or a lot of the kind of, if you talk to a lot of the artists associated with the Springs, there's a lot of talk about how these springs kind of are they're a place that's like thin between, like, the material world and the outer world. I mean, that's what the spiritual belief is. So I think it's really interesting that you bring that point up, because that is something that is discussed quite frequently within that kind of type of literature.
I would love to gather stories like that. I think that would be, and the idea of thin places is an old one, excuse me, probably in cross-culturally, but the tradition that I'm most familiar with, that I've done the most reading about, is the Celtic tradition, and the places where two worlds meet, where the liminal places, the places where, like for springs, earth and water, the springs are like a portal between the two. Places where there's a lot of mist or fog, these kind of places at the edges of things, the ecotones in ecology, where you go from one mini ecosystem to another. These are places that are high energy places. And I think there's I actually have been to another place here near where I live that had the most energy of any place I've ever been to in Florida. It's an old river rise or an old spring like an Itchituckney where the water no longer flows, but it's just a powerful landscape. Just oozing power and energy. I went down into it on a geology field trip, and I just immediately flipped into some kind of ecstatic state that was completely unexpected. And if you believe that there are local deities, local protectors, which my spiritual tradition, which is Tibetan Buddhism, teaches, that could well be one of those places. Our springs could be some of those places. Springs are sacred in many different cultures around the world. And that idea of sacred springs is something that's very interesting to me, and what my friend Rick Kilby has written about a lot in his 2 books about the springs of Florida.
I mean, yeah, like, ethnically I'm Greek, right? And it's like springs are abundant in Greek mythology. I mean, the foundation of Athens, right? It's like Poseidon gave Athens a spring. I mean, Athena gave them an olive tree, so they had to choose between the two. So, yeah, I totally understand that. I mean, just within my cultural context.
There was a spring at Delphi too, wasn't there?
Something like that, yeah. Margaret
Yeah,
Hilbert mentioned that. I mean, Lola Haskell, when I interviewed her, she mentioned how she was inspired by a river in Greece. I mean, this connection of water, it seems to be very omnipresent, you know.
it's profound, and it is sacred at a very deep level because we could not exist without it.
I mean, we're 75% of it, right? It's like fighting for water is essentially fighting for yourself in a lot of ways,
Yes, absolutely,
right?
absolutely. Yeah, and that's what we do as water advocates. We are fighting for everybody. We're fighting for not just the springs, but the Floridan aquifer, which is needed by our agriculturalists, by our businesses, for our healthy economy, for our human health. It's all connected there with the Floridan aquifer. It's not just about the springs, it's about our livelihoods and our lives.
So discuss that point a bit more. Yeah, how exactly is everything connected? And most importantly, what do you think? What do you think more people need to understand about how interrelated these water systems are with our economic, our physical, our cultural health?
Well, nobody, we are living in a very interesting time because a lot of people are now able to live wherever they want to and work remotely. Um, so nobody's going to want to live and nobody's going to want to open a business in an area where nobody wants to live. And if you don't have clean, healthy water, nobody's going to want to live there. So the other connection that I've seen is the springs are the top layer of the Floridan aquifer. So what's visible in the springs, the conditions in the springs, reflect what could be problems with our drinking water. So, when we look at the springs, we're not just looking at a spring, we're looking at our drinking water, we're looking at something that connects every single person who relies on that water, whether you're a water advocate, whether you're a farmer, whether you're a business person, whether you're a householder with a family and you want healthy kids. We're just all connected through this web. Actually, I've seen it as in a dream as a web of springs that pulsate and glimmer and shine throughout this whole landscape. So it's a demonstration of interconnection. And when we fracture ourselves, when we pick camps, like I'm a water advocate and therefore I don't like what the farmers are doing, or I'm a farmer and I really can't stand these water people, or I'm a business and I want to be able to do whatever I want to be able to do and never mind how it affects my neighbors or the people downstream from me. We lose. We lose this idea of community, and we lose the chance to make a difference for all of us and for our natural world.
Absolutely, and this idea of bipartisanship definitely seems to be something that, is probably that Springs advocacy shows as a huge lesson, right? Because there's no evil person here. I mean, there's really not. I mean, maybe
No,
a few, right? But it's incredibly rare. Farmer, a Springs advocate, businessman, whatever. We're all drinking the same water. I mean, there doesn't have to be an enemy. I mean, if there is, when we create these, we create them artificially sometimes, and for literally no reason, and it's hard to understand that
what
sometimes.
what has happened that I've observed, and this is just one person's opinion.
Mm.
Water advocates started out by pointing out the problems in the springs and assigning accountability for those problems to the heavier polluters. And the heaviest polluters in this area of the state, and I'm talking north central Florida, Springs Heartland region, is agriculture. And our state documents prove that in the basin management action plans. It's established scientific fact. By pointing this out, somehow or other, that got translated into not just problem identification, but personal attacks on farmers and ranchers and growers. And those things should not be communicated as personal attacks, because they're not. I don't believe that any farmer or anybody engaged in agriculture in this area gets up in the morning and says, oh, I'm going to destroy the spring today. They just don't. They're trying to make a living. But what they're doing is affecting the springs, and there's no solution to those problems without those people, because we as water advocates can't tell them what to do. We don't know enough about farming. I mean, I'm learning a lot about farming in a group I'm involved with at the UF Water Institute, and it's extremely complex. And if the farmers lose those lands, then what happens is development comes in. And I don't think any of us who have chosen to live in these rural areas want that to happen, although some of it is inevitable. But so somehow or other, this got conveyed as personal attacks, was taken personally, became an us versus them thing. And it really needs to be all of us trying to solve the problems. And if I can do anything in my role, I want to try to move us as much as possible into that mindset and away from this us versus them. There's also a thing of everybody will say, oh, you're pointing fingers. Well, there's pointing fingers and there's accountability, and they're two different things. You can hold someone accountable, you can say someone is accountable, but it doesn't have to be nasty. It can be communicated in different ways.
So how do you translate, that this kind of dynamism you just mentioned into policy, right? So how do we kind of find that nexus between what the farmers need and what the environmentalists are kind of advocating for, and how do we push that from a policy standpoint? Because to me, that's kind of where it seems like the disconnect is kind of happening.
To me, it's very, very political, and it's what goes on now in Florida is very much politically directed. When you look, my educational background is in anthropology, and we're trained to look at social systems as total systems. So when you look at what's happening, you see that the governor of Florida appoints not only the head of the Department of Environmental Protection, who then has to be approved by the cabinet. Whoever is governor also appoints the board of directors of the water management districts, who make the decisions about the big water use permits that come through. Whoever is the governor also appoints the head of the Division of Administrative Hearings, which is where a lot of the challenges to the actions by DEP and our water management districts go. So whoever's head of the Division of Administrative Hearings chooses the judges that sit and adjudicate those challenges. So whoever is the governor of Florida has a lot of power over how our water laws are enforced, or even if they are enforced, and what gets done in these different agencies. So in terms of affecting policy, it's really impossible for somebody like me to affect policy change because of the political structure that's driving these decisions. And I think, and I'm speaking for me personally now and not for the Itchitucknee Alliance, because we're a 501c3 and we can't oppose or endorse individual candidates. But for me, we really need to have different leadership with a stronger commitment to clean waters, a stronger commitment to our springs, a stronger commitment to helping save what's savable still of original natural Florida. We can work in our own little silos. We can work on things like the new state constitutional amendment to clean and healthy waters that I mentioned to you. But until there's that change, that shift in the paradigm, right now our operating paradigm is water is free to everybody who wants it almost as much as they want. And water is an infinite resource, and it isn't. So until we can shift that paradigm to realize that fresh water is limited and that we need to be managing it like conservatively, like you'd manage a trust fund for your kids, we're going to continue to see bad things happen to our springs and to our rivers.
And how do we?
I don't know if that answers your question, but the policy part is really key, but it's tied to the political part, and you can't change policy without changing political attitudes, I don't think.
No, it definitely answers my question really well, and I'm really happy that you kind of broke it down, in terms of responsibility, because I wasn't aware of that.
People don't know that, and we've actually got 3 short videos on the Itchitucknee Alliance websites that explain that to people. And I always say, we can't tell you who to vote for. We wouldn't even if we could, because that's a personal decision. But we can educate you about the process and the power structure that exists here, because people don't understand it. There were something like 19 or 20,000 public comments made recently to the Swanee River Water Management District about one water use permit they were considering. And I don't think they even looked at those comments. They weren't required to consider that. There's a whole thing in the laws that say these water use permits have to represent the public interest. And there's no definition of what public interest means. Is it the public interest of the person who wants the permit? Is it the public interest of the public? Is it the public interest of the people who are interested in springs? Is the public interest of the agriculturalists? Who is the public, and what are the interests? And that's a big, big stumbling block. And it's something that the public, when they make these comments, don't understand. They think, well, 19,000 of us made these comments and these people still got this permit. How did that happen? And it's the power structure that's behind everything.
Yeah, and through this project, that's definitely something I've kind of been, thinking quite a bit about is, these water management districts and, the way they're kind of structured. I mean, on one hand, it does make sense that, because water policy decisions are a long-term play, to have people that aren't necessarily at the kind of whim of, the public, right? You don't want these demagogic figures to kind of exist. But on the other hand, right, there needs to be some accountability. There needs to be some level of public interaction, because at that point, I mean, you can't just do whatever you want, right? You have no accountability besides the person that appointed you. So, I mean, I don't know what the answer to that question is.
It's an interesting conundrum, because I think what's happening now is we're at really a pivotal point I think when our water laws were enacted back in the 1970s, around 1972, when the Clean Water Act was passed, Florida also enacted water laws that everybody back then thought were great and that were models for the rest of the country. But what's happened since then is there have been big changes in agriculture with the introduction of center pivot irrigation and things like that. I mean, back before that happened, which I think started back in the 1960s, farming in Florida was done without a lot of irrigation. There wasn't a whole heck of a lot you could do here because the soils are so poor. But there have been these advancements in irrigation, advancements in fertilization, population growth. And so we're now at a time when we're looking back and we can see that those well-intentioned water laws, although they functioned fine for a number of years, they're not meeting the needs that are going on right now because of these changes that have happened in the larger culture. And at some point, our laws have to adapt. That's something that I've been real interested in through a group of lawyers at the Center for Earth Jurisprudence down at Barry University Law School in Orlando. They really did a lot to educate me about the legal background of all this. And then when I think about the societal changes, it's like we've come to this really, I guess it's like a tipping point of where we either are flexible and change, or we stick to what we're doing now and we watch everything around us eventually being destroyed. And that may not happen tomorrow, that may not happen 10 years from now, but it's eventually going to happen if we keep on the path that we're on right now.
Have you heard of the term adaptive management before?
I have heard it. I am not super familiar with it, but I think it means you respond to these changes as you see them happening. And I don't see a big response happening. Although if people are starting to talk about that, that's a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think this idea that, things are fluid, right? I mean, that's an ancient idea. I mean, the Greek philosopher Heraclitus, mentioned that, you never step in the same river twice. And,
Right.
yeah, I mean, quite, so it's like, it makes absolute sense to implement that from a policy standpoint, right? Because the way Florida was 5 years from now is definitely not going to be the way it was 10 years from now. And especially if things are something as fluid as water consumption or food or technology, right? I mean, our technology is growing exponentially. So, I mean, I think that definitely needs to be something that we discuss maybe seriously from a policy standpoint. I think that might be and I think that might be a good way of kind of mitigating a lot of these kind of issues that we're kind of seeing between these kind of two opposing, positionalities.
Yeah, and you mentioned technology, and something that I've been big on since I got involved with this is asking the question, can we stop pollution at the source? Right now, the emphasis seems to be on making incremental changes in terms of reducing the amount of fertilizer we're using, reducing the impact that septic tanks have on the environment. But I really think unless you ask the question, can we stop pollution at the source, or how do we stop pollution at the source? Excuse me, you never find out that that's possible or impossible because you never ask the right question. So I think a lot of what goes on now is it's like reading the tarot cards. It's really important to figure out what the questions are that we should be asking. And one of the questions that I'm asking, in addition to how do we stop pollution at the source, is how do we make it possible for farmers to still make a living and stay on their land without damaging our springs and without damaging our drinking water? And whether that happens through subsidies, cost sharing, how that can happen is something that the agriculturalists are really going to have to struggle with and figure out, because I can't tell them how to do that.
So you've mentioned agriculture quite a few times. I was looking at some of the St. John's River Management District numbers, and the chart in that they have the chart that kind of breaks down water usage right by these different groups, and it says only 25% of total water usage is a result of agriculture, and 55 and something percent is the result is used from like domestic people like me, like you, like schools, etc. I mean, you know, given the difference between those numbers, right, 55%, like 25%, why why do you think agriculture is why do you think agriculture is still kind of the main problem?
It's it, those figures are going to be different in every water management district because
Okay.
every water management district is different. And here in the Swanee River Water Management District, agriculture is the biggest polluter.
Mm.
And I'm not sure if they're the biggest water user. I can talk about Columbia County because that's where the Itchitucknee is. And this is another good example of interconnection. In Columbia County, the biggest polluter is agriculture. In Columbia County, the biggest use of water is for public supply, and that includes public utilities and domestic self supply, which is people on private wells like I am, lumped together. They're two separate things statistically, but when you lump them together, water for people, that's the biggest use of water in Columbia County. So here you have the biggest use for people, the biggest polluter is agriculture. It means we're all involved. It means we're all interconnected. And those figures are different for different counties and they're different for different water management districts. So you can get into some really interesting Facebook discussions from people who come from different areas of Florida saying, no, septic tanks are the big thing. No, agriculture is the big thing. And you have to recognize that it's different all through Florida. Florida's a big state and it's diverse, not just in population, but in ecosystems and problems.
Yeah, and this idea of locality, I think, is definitely an important point to kind of promote, right? This idea that every single spring, every single lake, every single body of water is completely different because
Yes,
the people will operate differently. But at the same time, I think that, and I think there has been a push for this, right? This idea that we can promote locality, right? We can promote these solutions from a hyper local kind of standpoint, while still allowing, but still creating but by still creating standards that kind of are more of an umbrella term, right? So kind of, promoting locality while being, wise enough to understand that to understand regionally how things affect one another.
absolutely. And this gets also to Cynthia Barnett's idea of a water ethic.
Mm.
If we had people who chose to exercise personal responsibility at kind of its most focused point, which is in their own homes, in their own businesses, we need to realize in this part of Florida that I'm talking about, Springs Heartland, every drop of water that we use is one less drop for our rivers and our springs. A geologist told me that, and that stuck in my head. So if we could all, if I could wave a magic wand and we could all adopt our own water ethic based on that, I think we could do a lot. We could eliminate lawn irrigation, which really is a waste of fresh water. You can use rainwater, you can use reclaimed water, you can have springs friendly yards that don't need water.
Yeah, you can not have a
um,
lawn.
and that would be a big shift, that would be a big paradigm shift to say that we care more about ourselves and our natural world than we care about the aesthetic of our lawn. So there's that kind of thing that goes behind all this, and how you get people to make these kinds of shifts is a challenge. Um, have you talked to Stacy Greco at all in Alachua County? She's been working big time on some of these issues.
Not yet, though I have
Okay.
on the list of people contact. Just haven't gone to her yet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, but policy, personal responsibility, aesthetics, ethics, they're all tied together in kind of a big web, and it's how do we affect that web in the way that we need to make positive change.
Absolutely. And I kind of want to start discussing. I want to start discussing, um, kind of these different kind of groups that exist, right? So you're part of the Interconnectedness River Alliance. You have our Santa Fe River. You have the Silver Springs one, etc. I mean, why are groups like that so powerful? And then specifically things like the Silver Springs Council, which kind of bring all these groups together. Why is that so significant?
It's significant because we're voices for places that don't have a voice. And I have to laugh when you say we're powerful, because I'm not sure how powerful we really are, but we do provide that voice. Our Santa Fe River has a great slogan, which is giving our river a voice. And I've always loved that. Our tagline for the Itchitucknee is "Bring back the blue," because the water that used to be blue is now kind of greenish. Um, but these groups exist. Historically, I can give you the background. Bob Knight, who is the executive director of the Florida Springs Institute, has really been the leader in a lot of this, and also Jim Stevenson, who I think you've interviewed. They saw a need for these kind of advocacy groups, and they helped get them formed. And then out of the Springs Institute, that wanted to concentrate on the hard science and the education, evolved the Florida Springs Council, which is more involved with policy and watching what's going on in Tallahassee and commenting about that. And then the little groups like mine, our Santa Fe River, Silver Springs Alliance, all those groups kind of formed around their local concerns. And we could not do what we do without the science that's coming out of the Florida Springs Institute, because it's an independent, politically independent nonprofit. And you can't say anymore, unfortunately, that what comes out of some of our academic institutions is politically independent. There's too much political influence. There's too much corporate influence in terms of funding for things. So FSI, Florida Springs Institute, is really key to what we're all doing. And then the Springs Council evolved builds on that by watching policy and the bills that go through the legislature in Tallahassee.
Yeah, I've interviewed Robert Knight a couple months ago as part of the project, so
Mm-hmm.
he's on record, and I've spoken to him a few times after that. So yeah, he's definitely doing amazing work. Um,
Yes.
so we talk a lot about interconnectedness, right? So we obviously have the springs issue, right? But all these springs, they still make their way through the Gulf of Mexico, to the Atlantic, to the Caribbean, etc., the Everglades. I mean, and one thing I kind of find that one thing I found that's been missing is that you have these kind of Springs people, but then you have the Everglades people, then you have the Keys people. So you have these almost divisions of kind of water advocates, but there hasn't been really any large kind of movements statewide to kind of bring all these different groups together. Why do you think that is, and do you think that's something that needs to exist?
Yeah, that's a real bugaboo, and it's something that I wish would happen more. Unfortunately, when you get groups that take a position on something, there are going to be other groups, for whatever reason, are not comfortable with that or are not willing to take that position because of internal dynamics, because of external dynamics. I have long advocated that if all the water groups could band together enough to create one big PR campaign for water in Florida with coordinated messaging. It wouldn't have to be exact same messaging, obviously, because conditions in the glades are different. But if we could coordinate even just messages, that would be a big thing, because so many people move to Florida and from other places and have no idea what our hydrological system is like, what our what our water problems are and how they are affecting our water problems. But I tend to talk about these big ideas and they tend to fall on deaf ears. So I'm not sure what the disconnect is there, but there are fractures within the environmental community that I don't think need to be there, but they're there. So I could go on about that, but it's probably a good idea not to.
I mean, yeah, I mean, and that kind of, but that gap is exactly why this project exists, right? Because it's like, I wanted to understand the entire story of water because every drop is connected to one another. I mean, Florida is incredibly unique because we have the Gulf of Mexico, the Atlantic, the Caribbean, the Glades, the Springs, etc. So it's like, I mean, the whole point of this project is to kind of, maybe perhaps use that as a means to tell the entire story.
There's
But
a classic example of what you're talking about right here in North Florida. The Ichetucknee is a tributary of the Santa Fe River.
mm,
The Santa Fe River is a tributary that feeds into the Suwannee River. The Suwannee River flows down and out into the Gulf, down near Cedar Key. So the people in Cedar Key that have, I think it's the clams that they're
oysters.
harvesting now, those clams depend on a certain mix of fresh water and salt water. And if the fresh water is polluted or if they're not getting enough of it, that's going to affect the livelihoods of people down there. So that's one way that our district here connects with what's going on in the coast. So you might want to talk to somebody over in Cedar Key. I could try to get you the name of somebody. But that's a real intense connection right there. And then, of course, what's going on in the Indian River Lagoon and down at Lake O gets discussed all kind of ways. But the way that I think it needs to be talked about is the pollution that's entering those water bodies from elsewhere. And how do we stop that? So, yeah, you're right. There's a kind of a disconnect in the messaging across the groups that really could be finessed in better ways, I think.
And then another big motif we've been discussing is the city of communication, right? So when you're an activist, right, when you're starting off and you want to start talking to all these different kind of stakeholders, right? I mean, how have you managed to kind of find that common ground, break bread with these people that might seem completely different from the way you think?
Well, for me, it comes back to my spiritual tradition and the fact that we view everybody as potential Buddhas, and we realize the interconnections between all of us. So, and in terms of communication, I think you have to approach people as people first, and then talk about your issues. That's the tack I've always taken. I don't know actually how effective it is. Time will tell, but we're all just people. We're all just here on the same planet together. We're technically neighbors when you look at the picture of the big blue marble in space. We're neighbors, even though we may live across the world from each other. We're on the same planet going through the solar system. So you kind of have to take that big global view, I think, before you start judging people, before you start pointing fingers. And if you're assigning accountability, you need to do it in a way that makes it clear that it's not personal. It's just a problem identification. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. So discuss the nuance of that then. So I'm talking to a farmer, right? I'm saying that the BMPs you're implementing, are rather horrible for the environment. What model do you use to get that message across? And I ask these questions simply because it's like I think it's important to help people that are listening understand. This is the way you do things. It's a more effective way of doing
Right.
things.
Well, I'm involved with a group called FACETS. It's Florida and Aquifer Collaborative Engagement for Sustainability that I was invited to sit on to represent the Itchitucknee Alliance. It's a 5-year study that's being done by the UF Water Institute and some other institutions to build a water model for North Florida and South Georgia that's going to look at different crop management systems and how those crops affect the springs and the aquifer. And what I say when I'm in those meetings, when I'm confronted with questions about BMPs or BMAPs, for example, is we have no scientific proof yet that BMPs or BMAPs have made a difference in any springs or river in Florida. And you kind of have to step back and just couch it in science and just tell it like you see it and be straight with them, but not say, well, it's all your fault because you're doing this. We're just saying we don't see it. And we can also say things like, we think you may need stronger best management practices. We think the math in your basin management action plan doesn't add up. And we currently have a challenge about that in the First District Court of Appeals in Tallahassee, because our state challenge in Division of Administrative Hearings about that BMAP, which our scientists told us this math does not add up. And this is not going to make a difference. So we challenged it. We were viewed unfavorably in that challenge at Division of Administrative Hearings. So we've now appealed it, and it's gone into a district court, which is a whole different adjudication system. And we're still waiting on that decision. But I think we have to be clear about where we see the problems, but communicate it in a way that doesn't imply that the people who are farming are somehow defective or bad people, because they're not.
The interesting thing about BMPs and BMAPs is a lot of the research, a lot of those thresholds come from the University of Florida. And, it seems like, and if, there does seem to be evidence that they're rather ineffective, like you're saying. And I'm wondering kind of what the disconnect is between the academia that's happening here and kind of the reality that's happening out there. Because, this doesn't make any sense.
It gets back to the political influence in the water management districts and DEP. It all goes back to that political influence. Some of us are thinking that this is a good example. It's recently, the first MFLs that were set for the Santa Fe and the Itchitucknee River said that both of them needed to be in recovery. The MFLs get revisited every so often. In the most recent revisit, the Water Management District revised how it was collecting data, and all of a sudden they're saying that the Santa Fe River is now meeting its MFL and it just needs to be in prevention, when conditions really in the river have not, according to this, what scientists are telling us, have not changed. And what scientists are telling us too is that when the water management districts make these figures, and they're actually done in the water management districts, not in the universities. When those calculations are made, they're choosing to ignore a lot of the historical data that we have on the springs. So it's almost like they're cherry picking their data. And in this most recent reevaluation of the MFLs, all of a sudden, then they were able to issue this big, huge water use permit for the water bottling plant that's outside High Springs here. So there's some stuff going on that appears to be very, very iffy in terms of the science behind it. And I think it's because of that political influence. And I want to say this too about the water management districts. There are a lot of good people who work there, who need to keep their jobs, who have families and kids that they need to support. And I honestly don't know, if I were in their position, what I would do because when this political influence comes down, you kind of have to make some real hard personal decisions. Do I stay or do I go? And I know a person who I personally know who was fired from St. John's Water Management District because he would not fudge the numbers. And this is public record. So that kind of stuff goes on. It's unfortunate. It doesn't serve any of us well, but it goes on.
Yeah, I mean, it, it's in, it, and it's incredibly frustrating because if you can't even trust objective numbers, right? I mean, what are you supposed to believe? And it's like, and if it's complicated for people like, like you, who's in the trenches every single day. I mean, imagine how complicated it is for the average person who doesn't spend 90% of their time thinking about this to kind of wrap their mind around, and then
Absolutely. Yeah. And I remember when I was in grad school, I did my graduate program in California in public administration. We read a little book called How to Lie with Statistics that has always stuck with me. And it's very, very easy to do. Very easy to do. You have to excuse me for a minute. I have a cat who wants out of the room and she's raising heck. Where did you go? Well, she seems to have settled down. Sorry.
No worries. Yeah, because I'm looking at these numbers, right? I'm kind of trying to get into the geography kind of side of things, and the numbers just to kind of make sure my understanding is a bit more clear. And yeah, I don't know what to believe. I really don't sometimes, and I think
I don't. Yeah, and I don't have a head for numbers, so I have to rely on what people tell me because I'm in a totally different mindset. Sorry, cats.
Yeah, no problem. I have a cat.
My light is going too, so.
No problem. Yeah, I don't want to take up too much more of your time. But I guess the kind of final question I'll ask you is that to anybody that's listening, what final thoughts do you have, that type of thing.
Just for anybody who's listening,
Yeah, final thoughts, any words of wisdom.
think about how you're connected to other people. Think about how you're connected to our water. Think about what you can do to help if you feel moved to help. I tell people who want to get involved in water advocacy to check out their local groups and use your best talent, whatever it is you love to do, and do that. Find a way to do that to help that group, because that way, number one, you won't burn out because you're doing something that you like. And number two, you'll do your best work.
Absolutely, that's definitely sound advice. Well, I think with that concludes the interview.